The notorious crime syndicate is disbanded after the death of Liam McCaffrey. He died in prison of old age, ending a global empire of murder, robbery, and extortion. In Buffalo, New York, married couple Dan and Jessica Morgan are preparing to celebrate their anniversary. Jessica goes to the bar of the hotel where they have booked a room, and Dan talks to her on the phone and tells her how to get into the room. Meanwhile, he climbs the walls of the hotel, wanting to surprise his wife. Jessica enters the room and is pleasantly surprised to find a fancy necklace on the bed. While she's admiring the gift, Dan appears behind her and adds to the surprise effect. The couple begins to exchange warm words, recalling the wonderful years of their life together. But the romantic evening is interrupted by their eldest son Kyle and 4-year-old Max. "We need to return home urgently. The dog got sick." The couple rushes home without protest. Family is most important to them. They love spending time with children and helping them. A few weeks later, on Thanksgiving Day, the Morgans arrive at Jessica's parents' house and spend a fun day with their huge family. There is joy and bustle all around, and Dan even manages to prevent several potential troubles. At dinner, the Morgans' eldest daughter Nina, who is studying journalism in London, joins the family via video link and chats with everyone. Nina is excited to learn that her mother, a former athlete, has been named head coach of the Ohio State University women's track and field team. She convinces Jessica to accept the offer, although she's afraid to ask her husband to leave the city he loves so much. Before passing out, Nina advises Jessica to talk to Dan as soon as possible. A few days later, while Dan is enthusiastically busy decorating for the holidays, he is upset to learn that Nina has decided not to come home for Christmas. He convinces her to change her mind so that the family can spend the holiday together as usual. Dan then scolds gamer son Kyle for hacking into the school's network and deleting all the students' grades as a prank, and warns him to focus on his studies. The next day, Dan goes to work at his security consulting firm. There he receives a job offer in London and accepts it, hoping to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, organize the whole family's move to celebrate Christmas with Nina, quickly fulfill the order, and advise the bank on security issues. Later, Kyle is driving the whole family home, while Dan watches the road carefully and enthusiastically tells everyone about his plan, Christmas in London. He persistently convinces the doubting family and eventually gets his way. However, Kyle gets distracted by the conversation and almost gets into an accident. A few days later, the family arrived in London and were charmed by the festive atmosphere. That same day, instead of waiting for Nina at the hotel, Dan decides to surprise her and brings his family to her apartment. Nina is shocked. She did not have time to get rid of her boyfriend Omar. Nina reluctantly introduces Omar to the family. The whole family seems to be okay with him, except for Dan, who is overprotective of his daughter. Later, Morgan and Omar go for a walk through the busy city, and Omar impresses the boys by showing off his cool parkour skills. Unfortunately, Max decides to follow Omar's example and fails, forcing Dan and Jessica to go on the run. The man reprimands the boy. The young man takes criticism calmly and even advises his concerned father not to overdo it with guardianship. This is what, he says, destroys the relationship with his father. The next morning, Nina meets her family at the hotel. She spends time with her mother and persistently convinces her to quickly tell Dan about the offer from Ohio. At this time, the head of the family goes to a business meeting at the bank. Later, the girl takes the brothers to the park. She hopes this will give Jessica time to gain courage. At the bank, Dan, while analyzing security weaknesses, meets a man named Aiden Clark. A stranger asks to demonstrate vulnerabilities by hacking the system on site. The specialist leads the guest through isolated corridors to the cells, sequentially bypassing the security mechanisms. They eventually reach the vault. Dan invites Aiden in, but promptly strangles him. An experience I noticed. The man is clearly not from the bank and is pursuing some of his own goals. It requires legitimation. However, the guest manages to show a photograph of the kidnapped Jessica, and Dan is forced to let him go. The stranger then calls Specialist Sean McCaffrey, an old criminal alias, and reveals that he is his half-brother Finn. He says their father, Liam McCaffrey, had a relationship with the maid, but left her when he found out she was pregnant. Finn admits that he has always been jealous of his brother, whom Liam adored, and cannot forgive his father for his betrayal. The attacker then orders one of the cameras to be opened. Inside is a key to Liam's criminal legacy. Finn threatens to expose Dan's past if he goes to the police. He then threatens the family and forces the specialist to take the blame for the bank robbery. This is the only way for both of them to get out. Dan ends up having to fake taking Finn hostage by leaving the building. After leaving, Finn gives the order to release Jessica. The woman rushes into the arms of her husband, who immediately notices that there is a gun stuck in her hand. As the police approached, the couple hurried to leave the scene. You need to hide the weapon and get to the children as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Finn leaves with his men, but soon finds out about it. Dan stole his key. He decides to go to the hotel. The couple will probably go there for their offspring. Soon Dan calls Nina and asks her to gather the rest of the children. At this time, she and Omar are having fun in the park. You must wait for your parents at the designated place and get rid of your phones. Soon the boys and the young man find Dan and Jessica. The group takes off running, and along the way the man explains who Finn is. He manages to break away from his pursuers and get to the tourist bus. However, Finn catches up with the fugitives, points a gun at Dan, and demands to give up the key. In response, the man knocks his opponent down. A fierce battle begins. After a long struggle, Jessica intervenes in the confrontation. She sprays Finn with fire retardant, blinding him, and engages in combat. Seeing this, Dan decides to save his wife and give the family time to think about further actions. He throws the key out of the bus. The enemy is forced to leave the vehicle. When the group takes a short break, Dan explains. If Finn gets the key, he will have access to Liam's encrypted server, a large sum of money, the killer's contacts, and a global tracking system. According to the man, the only way out is to urgently leave England. Nina is shocked. She declares that she is ready to give up her usual life only on the condition that her boyfriend goes with her. Meanwhile, Finn arrives at Liam's Parisian mansion and presents the precious key to convince butler Vikram to let him inside. The servant takes the guest to an office where he uses the key to access the encrypted server. The Morgans, along with Omar, reach France, hiding in the back of a truck. They then head to the home of Dan's ex-girlfriend, Svetlana, a former Russian intelligence officer. They plan to hide there for a few days and think about their further actions. Dan asks the woman to send a message to an encrypted server. He hopes to meet Finn and resolve the conflict peacefully. Svetlana agrees to help and at the same time prepares dinner for everyone. While eating, she meets the family and makes a wish. Dan probably got married to bolster his cover. The guest then persistently forces the children to eat, despite their obvious disgust at her culinary creations. Later that day, Dan manages to arrange a meeting with Finn at the local museum. He goes there in hopes of resolving differences and finding common ground with his brother. One of them, Dan, cannot be blamed for the fact that he is not to blame, but the interlocutor shares memories of a difficult and lonely childhood, rejects an attempt to improve relations, and declares war. He then returns to the mansion, contacts several assassins, and orders Dan to be eliminated, promising a substantial reward. Before entering into open confrontation, the head of the family decides to cheer up his loved ones. He organized a boat trip so that everyone could enjoy the Parisian atmosphere of the Christmas holidays. That night, while the family sleeps, Dan remembers the wonderful day he spent with his family and shares his great happiness with Svetlana. The hostess offers the guest a drink. When a man talks about how much his family means to him, Svetlana suddenly feels remorse and confesses. She contacted Finn and revealed the whereabouts of the fugitives, hoping for a generous reward. Without giving Dan time to come to his senses, the woman adds that she mixed sleeping pills into his drink so that the killers could easily grab the victim. In a panic, Dan rushes through the house, trying to wake up the sleeping people and get them outside before his pursuers arrive, but loses his balance and falls. His strength finally leaves him. Then Svetlana reveals to the others the essence of what is happening and gives them her old car for an emergency trip. Kyle and Omar carefully carry the exhausted Dan. The family heads to the garage, preparing to escape. However, upon reaching the place, they hear a noise outside and see that ill-wishers are already waiting at the door of the house. With the head of the family lying in the back seat, Kyle, inspired by Jessica's encouragement, crashes into the garage door, surprising his opponents. The mercenaries give chase, gradually catching up with the fugitives in a rickety old car. A frenzied movement begins along the narrow streets of the city, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. After a grueling chase, the family finally managed to escape their pursuers. Whose car was it? In the morning, the group meets to discuss possible solutions to the situation. The first option is to run away and start over, still on the run from Fina and the police, who are convinced that Dan and Jessica robbed the bank. The second is to give in and report Finn. However, this risks revealing Dan's identity as Sean McCaffrey and exposing his criminal past, which would inevitably lead to life in prison. The family rejects both scenarios. Seeking a viable alternative, Omar suggests contacting his father, but the family rejects the idea, not even allowing the young man to pursue higher education. Dan soon realizes that the only chance to defeat Finn is to first destroy the encrypted server. To do this, you need to penetrate a carefully guarded mansion. The head of the family convenes a family council, where a reliable plan is jointly developed. As a result, a solution appears, the optimal path through the roof. Kyle then gives his father a flash drive that can erase the data on the server and permanently destroy the evidence against Sean McCaffrey. Dan then lays out the equipment seized from Svetlana's house and begins to detail the infiltration plan. This especially emphasizes Jessica. If the operation fails, she must stop everything immediately, take the children, and hide. Then, having gathered his relatives into a close circle, the man finally agrees to involve Omar in participation. Dan and Omar then head to the roof of the mansion and scale the walls with expert dexterity while the others remain in the car providing technical support. The duo skillfully navigate the roof and turn off the surveillance cameras one by one. Dan then uses his partner as a distraction. He quietly sneaks up on one of the mercenary guards and is surprised to recognize him as an old acquaintance. A man holds back the provocations of a security guard who is trying to provoke a fight. He disarms him and orders him to be tied up with a plastic collar. Moments later, the guard takes the opportunity, pulls out a hidden gun, and catches Dan at gunpoint. However, he handles the threat with his usual professionalism and, to the relief of his family, neutralizes the enemy. Kyle then, using advanced gadgets, imitates the voice of the neutralized guard, responding to Finn, who demands a report on the security status of the area. On Dan's instructions, Omar turns off the last camera and goes downstairs, where his comrades are staging a protest against the oil companies, creating the necessary diversion. Noticing this, Nina, an active member of Greenpeace, joins the demonstrators and leads them to the entrance of the mansion, publicly accusing the owner of harming the environment as the head of a large oil corporation. However, as soon as the lady left the crowd of protesters, the police detained her and began interrogating her about her involvement in the riots. Seeing this from afar, Omar creates a distraction and allows himself to be arrested, giving Nina a chance to escape. While Finn is planned to be distracted by what is happening on the wall of the mansion, Dan carefully opens one of the attic windows and finds himself in the attic, which was once his childhood room. Inside, a man is amazed to discover that his father has kept the room in its original condition and slowly walks around the space, immersed in waves of nostalgia. But after a few moments, due to the noise of the protest, Finn begins to suspect that something is wrong, decides to inspect the building, and finds Dan on the roof. To the horror of Morgan, who is watching through the headphones, Finn prepares to shoot Dan, but is stopped by the screen. The servant informs the new owner that the mansion has special rooms for such situations and recommends taking the prisoner there. Dan, acting according to a pre-planned scenario, leaves Kyle's flash drive and follows Finn to the underground hideout. A few minutes later, the situation escalated. Finn discovers Dan's communication devices and cruelly informs the family that they will never see the head of the family again. While the frightened family members try to find a way out, Kyle notices the flash drive left by his father and convinces the others. Despite the grim prospect, they can still help Dan if they find the media and use it on the server. Despite Dan's orders to leave him at the first sign of danger, Jessica decides to support her husband and heads to the mansion, warning the children. If the situation worsens, they should contact the U.S. Embassy. The woman then demonstrates her impressive athleticism by deftly leaping across the rooftops of buildings to reach her goal. Once inside, she enters her husband's former nursery and, carefully examining the echoes of his childhood, discovers a flash drive. With Nina's encouragement, Jessica brings the carrier into the office. In the underground hideout, Vikram orders Finn to position Dan above the sewer and open fire. Just as the victim freezes over the pit and the killer is about to pull the trigger, the servant pulls the lever and the man falls into the drain pipe, escaping death. Angered by the betrayal, Finn rushes to Vikram, but he firmly holds the line, not backing down from his decision. Meanwhile, upstairs, Jessica finally enters the office and turns on the flash drive, giving Kyle access to the system. The young man immediately activated the surveillance cameras and, together with his sister, began to coordinate his mother's movement around the mansion, skillfully leading her away from the mercenary patrolling the building. Soon the woman will have to hide in the closet. The enemy enters the office. Feeling in a hopeless situation, she suddenly jumps out, catching the enemy by surprise. A fierce battle begins. In an underground tunnel, Dan methodically neutralizes one enemy after another. Thanks to his excellent knowledge of the labyrinth of tunnels, the man finds a hiding place that allows him to successfully defend himself from intruders. In the office, with the anxious gaze of children broadcast through the screens, Jessica wages a desperate battle with the mercenary and eventually knocks him out. Outside, Nina notices Finn's men approaching their car and urgently asks Kyle to finish wiping the server so the group can escape immediately. At this time, Jessica ran out of the mansion, trying to come to the children's aid. Inside the building, Finn is furious when he learns that the server has been hacked. Notification of money transfer. Delete all entries. $500 million were withdrawn, and all files were destroyed. In anger, he vows to deal with Dan and his children, taking revenge for the thwarted plans. Outside, Jessica gives children rides on the city carousel. Having managed to help them escape from the mercenary pursuing them, the woman decides to surrender to the police along with her children. She reveals their identities and asks for protection. At the same time, a fierce battle between Dan and Finn continues in the mansion. In the end, the man manages to defeat his opponent. He ties him up and hangs him from a ceiling. Leaving the building, Dan finds himself under arrest, but his heart fills with joy at the sight of the whole family, even if each of them is in handcuffs. I told you it doesn't matter where I'm at for Christmas. Idat, I love you. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Remember how money disappeared from grandfather's accounts? Discussing their future fate, the Morgans come to a common conclusion. Wherever they find themselves, the most important thing is their unity. Moments later, Omar appears on stage, accompanied by his father, who holds the position of Secretary General of Interpol. It is he who will call heroes from a hopeless system. You can be proud of your son, sir. They broke the most dangerous criminal network in the world. This is my wife, Jessica. Hello. And Jessica, gathering all her will into a fist, tells Dan the news about the proposal from Ohio. The man is genuinely happy and fully supports his wife. After 11 months in Columbus, Jessica, Dan and Max have successfully settled into their new home and are preparing for Nina and Kyle's holiday visit. The latter is already a student. The woman achieves success at work and experiences real happiness in the new reality. Dan maintains regular contact with Omar through video calls. The interlocutors exchange news and never tire of repeating how much they value their friend's companion. That's why Dan is truly delighted when he learns that Omar plans to come visit him for Christmas. A month later, Dan visits the prison to visit Finn. He brings his brother a Christmas gift, a matching jacket, realizing how meaningful it is and will help him feel like he's part of something bigger. They then sit down to play cards, gradually mending their broken relationship.